the latest weapons, coupled with the fighting skill of the American soldier, stand ready, on the alert all over the world to defend this country, you, the American people, against aggression. This is the big picture, an official television report to the nation from the United States Army. Now, to show you part of the big picture, here is Sergeant Stuart Queen.
For most of the United States Army divisions which fought in Korea, that land was a strange and alien one. But not for the 7th Infantry Division. When the 7th, along with the Marines and other elements of the 10th Corps, executed the bold invasion of Incheon in the early fall of 1950, it was for the division a return to a land it had known in calmer times. For at the end of World War II, the 7th Division had moved into Korea to accept the surrender of the Japanese troops south of the 38th parallel. The division remained in South Korea on occupation duty until the end of 1948, when it left for Japan. Less than 2 years later, the 7th Division was back in Korea, fighting this time to drive a new aggressor from the tortured land of the morning calm. This is the story of the 7th Infantry Division's performance in that fight.
By the end of World War II, the 7th Infantry Division had learned a good deal about amphibious invasion. It had made some of the toughest, Kwajalein and Leyte and Okinawa. In 1946, with victory, there remained one other landing in the Pacific for the division to make, Korea. Korea was not yet a name to weigh heavily on the world's conscience. It was just a remote Asiatic peninsula whose people had suffered for years under Japanese occupation and welcomed now the victorious allies who had come to accept the enemy's surrender. For the men of the 7th Division, this was how the vision of victory, so tenaciously held in days of trouble, became real. A bitter and oppressive enemy was defeated. And with that defeat, a new day of peace and stability promised to return to the troubled Orient and to the entire world. In victory, there was hope, and even over the unhappily destined land of Korea, no shadow fell to mar that hope in the days that followed the end of the Second World War. Korea was an old country, but a quaint one, and what it lacked in modernization, it made up in friendliness. Its towns and villages were unscarred then. Its people were happy. Life for the soldiers of the 7th Division was not one of high excitement, but theirs was an important mission, for they were there to help the country establish itself as a free and independent nation. Their area of responsibility lay south of the 38th parallel, which separated Western and Russian responsibility. And in those first hopeful months of victory, the men of the 7th Division were shown the deceptive face of Russian cooperation. The 38th parallel, however, in the disillusioning months that followed, became an armed border, which the 7th Division guarded to preserve the peace until the division left Korea in 1948. The communist violation of that peace brought the 7th Division back to Korea in September of 1950 as part of the 10th Corps' spectacular invasion of Incheon. Warfare in Korea was 3 months old when the 7th Division, along with the Marines, invaded the port on Korea's western coast below the capital city of Seoul. Other elements of the United Nations forces, hastily put into battle to stem the North Koreans' aggressive adventure, were holding desperately to the port of Busan in the south. The Incheon invasion, in the very heart of the land the enemy held, gave heart and hope to those beleaguered divisions, and indeed to the entire worried world of free men. The Korean people welcomed the 7th Division back to their land as more than old friends. American soldiers now stood between them and a new subjugation. For the men of the 7th, there was a difference too. The calm and peaceful Korea they had known had disappeared, and the roads of this new land were hard to travel. Against swiftly forming resistance, the division pushed steadily inland. The North Korean enemy was strong, and he had had a series of successes, but the Incheon invasion had caught him by surprise. Taking fullest advantage of this surprise, the 7th Division was able to establish strong positions before the enemy could rally. After the invasion, the 1st Cavalry Division broke out of the Pusan perimeter in the south and drove north 102 miles to link up with the 7th. At Osan, the 7th Division waited. The link-up was a triumphant turning point in the war, splitting the enemy's forces in half. Once the juncture was made, the 7th Division pushed straight north toward Seoul. Little more than a week after the Incheon landing, they had reached the banks of the Han River, which separated them from Seoul. First elements of the division crossed the river on the 25th of September. As they touched shore on the opposite bank, the greatest prize of the war was just ahead, Seoul, and they pushed toward it, removing all opposition in their path. Seoul lay in ruins when the United Nations forces reached it. Korea's once magnificent capital city had been shelled and burned by the enemy in his drive south, and the United Nations had been forced to fire upon it to drive the enemy out. Consequently, many of its buildings were rubble, many of its structures reduced to powdered ash. But for all its devastation, Seoul was South Korea's first city and the symbol of the young nation's integrity. So it was a triumphant day when General MacArthur, commander of the UN forces, was able to deliver the city once again to the nation's president, Syngman Rhee. With Seoul secure, the 7th Division regrouped and undertook another amphibious invasion in enemy-held land, this time at Iwon, on the east coast of the peninsula. It was late October 1950 when the 7th Division landed at Iwon. The landing was unopposed. The Incheon invasion in the west and the breakout of the Pusan perimeter in the south had generated a momentum which had carried the United Nations forces up to the 38th parallel and beyond it. As the men of the 7th Division came ashore at Iwon, the hope for early victory was strong. Their mission was to drive straight north and advance to the Korean-Manchurian border. Fall weather changed to winter the farther north they marched. With the bitter cold came snow, which became a formidable enemy now. But snow or cold could not stop a team that had felt the advantage shift to them in the turning tide of war, and knew now that they could reach the very limits of the enemy's own land, and then the North Korean communists would be defeated. So on and on they rode, over roads where roads existed, sometimes over terrain that was hazardous to travel. There are always more men than tanks, and someone has to walk. The towns and villages between E1 and the border fell to them, but not without a struggle. The 7th Division saw some heavy fighting in their push north through these mountains. Dug into the hills, the communists had to be blasted out. Division infantrymen had to overrun the enemy in their foxholes before the land could be considered secure. The mountains were formidable barriers, but they made it to the border. By late November, part of the division had reached the banks of the Yalu River. Thanksgiving service that year, in the northernmost reaches of enemy territory, was a meaningful one. The turkey dinner was festive. Even for the men at the outposts, braving the winds off the frozen Yalu, this Thanksgiving was something special, for final victory could come now any day. Their guns were silent. They had reached the very limit of the defeated enemy's land, and there were no more enemy in sight while they enjoyed the traditional trimmings of this holiday. The turkey leg had real flavor that year. But then suddenly, all along the line, a new enemy struck, and an entirely new war began. Out of Manchuria came hordes of Chinese communist forces. The impact on the UN line was staggering. Elements of the 7th Division fighting with the 1st Marine Division at the Chosin Reservoir were outnumbered 10 to 1 by the Chinese invaders. Withdrawal was blocked by the enemy who had surrounded them. The days that followed for the embattled soldiers of the 7th Division and the Marines with whom they fought their way out of the Chinese encirclement were days of hardship and courage. Unbelievable hardship and unbelievable courage. In a blinding snowstorm in early December, they made their last big push to reach Hungnam on the coast. Other elements of the 7th Division, withdrawing from the Yalu River, had easier going in their effort to reach Hungnam. The resistance they encountered in their withdrawal was slight. All elements of the division, those who survived, reached Hungnam successfully by December the 11th, 2 long and bitter weeks after the Chinese Communist offensive began. Vessels lay waiting at the port to receive the weary men who had made the long trip by land. Everything that could fight went aboard these ships. And those for whom the fighting was over. Supplies of all kinds were loaded on to be used again. Uprooted Korean people, fleeing the threat of communist enslavement, jammed the waterfront. They were escaping the war, traveling along with soldiers who would fight again as soon as they could regroup in the South. The Chinese Communist offensive had pushed the United Nations forces back to below the 38th parallel, and the advance to recover lost ground was slow and painful work. During the first few months of 1951, the soldiers of the 7th Division fought several successful engagements with the enemy, each time winning a little more real estate, pushing the United Nations line steadily north. The enemy had seeded the roads with explosives. The rough Korean weather had done its damage too and slowed the advance considerably. But the drive north rolled on despite handicaps. And in early April, the division crossed the 38th parallel. It was the first time across on land for them, and this time it was for keeps. With summer, when the war was a year old, the embattled soldiers of the 7th Division went into reserve, which for a few weeks meant a clean bunk and some fresh clothes. It gave weary men a chance to read mail from home and to catch up with the history being made all around. It was still field rations for chow, but the enemy's guns were a long way away, and that can be a great help to digestion. In reserve, the men of the division created their own entertainment, and gratefully took the entertainment that was supplied them by visiting performers. No troubadour ever received a warmer or more enthusiastic welcome from his audience than did the entertainment troops who visited the United Nations fighters in Korea. No supper club performer, however much his patrons paid to watch him, ever had it so good. While they were on reserve that June of 1951, the world was charged with hope that the fighting might end. The Soviet Union made overtures today to end the fighting in Korea by suggesting that the two sides get together for talks to set a ceasefire. Such a proposal coming from Russia left little doubt that the communist forces fighting in Korea are at last willing to discuss peace. The hope sparked by that announcement did not bring an early end to the fighting. For the first year after the peace talks began, however, the war was a relatively limited one for the 7th Division. But even when the enemy was quiet, the division's soldiers continued their battle with the Korean weather. Heavy rains made the already poor roads impassable, and the troops used every lull in the fighting to put them in shape again. For the most part, that first year of peace talks was for the 7th Division a time of constant patrol activity. A patrol is not a large group of men, usually about a squad. Its missions and its accomplishments are seldom on a spectacular scale. It's rare that the activities of a patrol gain the attention of the public or anyone outside the command itself. But as much as anything else in battle, the patrol is the slogging, day-to-day business of war. It was so in Korea. On days when the headlines reported light or scattered action, these hills were alive with men out on patrol. A patrol can have any one of a number of missions: to gather information about the enemy's strength or location, or the nature of his terrain, to protect the main body of a unit, or to actually engage the enemy in combat. Often a patrol finds itself so engaged before its mission is over. It's grim work, but it's soldiers' work. It's work that the men of the 7th Infantry Division did a lot in that quiet first year of armistice talks, while the world waited with fading hope for peace. Then the 7th Division went on an all-out offensive to take a mass of critical hills in the Kumwa Valley. The enemy's strong positions were blasted first from the air. Wave after wave of pulverizing airstrikes were necessary to soften up the objective areas. Army artillery pounded away incessantly while the tanks got in position to add their fire. The infantry waited to take over with rifles and bayonets, which the job would finally demand. The hills these men fought for became known to the world as Triangle Hill Complex. The soldiers knew only that the hills were steep, that they were alive with enemy fire, and that they had to be taken. They put everything they had into the assault, and finally the mass of vital high ground was theirs. Their corps commander said of these men during this period that they showed a determination that recognized no defeat, a voluntary spirit of self-sacrifice, and a quality of leadership thoroughly in keeping with the finest traditions of the service. In July 1953, the men of the 7th Division learned the news the world had been waiting to hear. The fighting was over. After 3 years of war and 2 years of peace talks, a ceasefire was signed between the UN forces and the communists. To the free world as a whole, the news meant that the United Nations had proved that aggression can be stopped through concerted effort. To the soldier on the line, it meant this, but something a good deal more fundamental besides. It meant there would be a silence now on the battlefield, and days without fear. After the truce was signed, the 7th Division tore down their bunkers and moved back to the ceasefire positions. Battlefield equipment, now no longer needed, was packed and stored away. The tools of war, ammunition and explosives which would not be needed for battle, went to the rear now, instead of being rushed to the front. The 7th Division is still in Korea today. With the fighting over, they have time now for relaxation and recreation. Invariably, their entertainment, like this carnival staged at Busan, has about it a strong flavor of horseplay, USA. The evidence of American interest, which the 7th Division symbolizes in Korea today, is everywhere apparent. The blood of America's sons and the treasure of its people are invested in the freedom of this beleaguered nation. And these gallant soldiers remain here to represent that investment. They are ambassadors now as well as soldiers, with a job that goes on month after month without ceasing. It is inevitable that some of the spirit and tradition of their homeland lives and grows here with them. Peace, however fragile, rests over Korea today. And as once before in their proud and venerable history, the soldiers of the 7th Infantry Division are standing alert to preserve that peace.
And that is the story of the 7th Division in Korea. Now, this is Sergeant Stuart Queen inviting you to be with us again next week for another look at your Army in action on The Big Picture.
The Big Picture is a weekly television report to the nation on the activities of the Army at home and overseas. Produced by the Signal Corps Pictorial Center. Presented by the United States Army in cooperation with this station. You too can be an important part of the big picture. You can proudly serve with the best equipped, the best trained, the best fighting team in the world today, the United States Army.